Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of Sarastro's Star Wars painting series. In this special double episode, we're going to paint both R2-D2 and C-3PO from Fantasy Flight Games' Star Wars Imperial Assault. Let's jump straight in with R2-D2 and begin by taking a look at the steps we'll be using to bring him to life. We'll begin by priming the droid with a white primer. We'll then apply the base colours, to be followed with a black wash, which will add some depth and really help bring out the detail of the panelled bodywork. We'll then highlight the silver dome, creating a gradient effect, along with all of the blue and the white areas. We'll then finish R2 off by painting the lights, as well as providing some optional weathering and a limited amount of gloss varnish. Let's begin. After removing mould lines and priming R2 in white, I've decided to remove him from his base now rather than later. This is because more handling is required than usual to do so, and I want to avoid rubbing off the paintwork later on. Once removed, we can mount the figure in the usual way. And now we're ready to begin painting. Because the primer I used is an off-white, I'm going to begin by brightening up the bodywork by applying a thin layer or two of pure white. Next, I'm going to paint all of the metal detailing with some Leadbelcher. I won't be using this for the dome of the droid, however, as I have something else planned for that. To capture the deep, rich tone of R2's blue areas, I'm going to be using Vallejo's dark Prussian blue. Something like Citadel's Cantor blue would also be fine for this. This is quite a fiddly miniature to paint, with quite small and highly contrasting areas of detail. The black wash we'll be adding later will help obscure some of these joints for us, but we still want to aim to be as neat as possible. We can afford to be a little less neat here, as we'll soon be painting over the surrounding areas of the dome. In this panel here, R2 has a pair of small pale lights, so I'm going to carefully draw around the edge and divide it across the middle, leaving two white squares which I'll be glazing over later on. There is also a thin blue strip that runs around the circumference of the head, but I'll be adding that in a moment. First, I'm going to paint the dome, and to recreate the slightly dull brushed metal look, I'm going to use an equal mix of Leadbelcher and Mechanicus Standard Grey. We can now paint on the blue strip that runs around the entire circumference of the droid. This should technically appear just above the join where the metallic head meets the white body, but I feel would be unnecessarily fiddly to do so, so my blue strip instead marks the transition between the two areas. I'm neatening up any scrappy edges with some white as I work. I'm now going to paint the large central lens with some pure black, which we'll be brushing some gloss varnish onto later on. Finally, I'm using some Sycorax Bronze for the cables connected to his feet. Most shades of brass or copper would be fine for this, however. Once the base colours have been applied, we're ready for the black wash. All we need to do here is coat the entire model with our black wash and soak up some of the excess. There isn't much that can go wrong here. The worst thing that can happen is if we miss a patch, as it will look out of place. We should also try to avoid the pair of lights on the front of the droid. We can see how beautifully the Nuln Oil darkens all of the indented sections and grooves in the bodywork. If you wished, you could get away with doing very little or no highlighting, and you would already have an R2-D2 that is more than good enough to hit the table. Let's now look at how we might add some highlights to make him stand out a little more. I'm going to start by highlighting the silver dome. Here, I'd like to create a gradient from dark at the back to light at the front, and I also want a slightly dull brushed steel effect. To do this, I'm going to create two mixes. An equal mix of Mechanicus Standard Grey and Leadbelcher for the darker tone, and an equal mix of Runefang Steel and White for the lighter tone. Here you can see the two mixes side by side. I'm going to start with a reapplication of the darker tone to smooth the area down following the black wash. I'm then going to mix in some of the lighter tone and focus just on the front and side facing parts of the dome. Notice I'm using mostly horizontal brush strokes whilst I do this. I will then add additional quantities of the lighter tone and reduce the area of highlight more and more towards the front portion of the dome. Pulling the brush rapidly off the miniature helps create a more tapered finish to each stroke, thereby producing smoother transitions. Here we can begin to see the gradient taking form. We can also see that the combination of metallic and non-metallic paint is doing a nice job of capturing the brushed metal effect. We can finish the effect off with a small highlight using the pure Runefang Steel and White mix, focusing just on the front centre portion of the dome. For the blue sections of the droid, I'm going to reapply some of my original base colour to even the tone out and neaten any scrappy edges. We can then either lighten our base tone with the addition of a little white, or use a separate lighter tone, and I'm using Vallejo's Prussian blue for this. Just as with the dome, I'm going to place greater emphasis on the more upturned frontal sections of the droid. I'm then adding a small amount of white to lighten the blue to provide my smallest final highlight. For the white areas, I'm creating an off-white mix by adding a little screaming skull along with some Administratum Grey to some white. Something like Vallejo's Silver Grey would also work well. Here I'm adding the screaming skull, and here the Administratum Grey. We would probably want the main areas of highlight to be the tops of the legs. I'm also going to brighten all of the front panel work. I'm only adding a few small touches to the rear of the body. I'm now going to add additional white to boost the highlights further in a couple of stages. Some edge highlighting here will work well. I'm going to finish the highlights with a small hit of pure white. We're now ready to add some finishing touches. I'm now going to paint the single light on the front of the head with a spot of pure white. To colour the light, I'm going to simply apply a red glaze. Two or three layers should give us a pleasing result. We can then apply a single layer of blue glaze for the pair of neighbouring lights. Next, I'm going to use some Typhus Corrosion to provide a little dirt and grunge. Both droids appear in the movies with widely varying amounts of weathering and battle damage, which gives us license to apply as little or as much as we like when painting them. I'm going to focus my dirt on the feet as well as the lower portions of the legs and body. I'm also using this to obscure any mistakes made along the way or details I'm less than happy with. Once done, we can apply a protective matte spray. I'm also rebasing my R2 at this point. I'm then going to apply a couple of layers of gloss varnish to the central black lens, which we want to have a high gloss finish. I'm then going to thin the varnish down quite a bit more with some water to add a more gentle, soft sheen to the silver dome. This could also be applied to most of the bodywork if you like, except of course for the weathered parts. And this completes R2-D2. Let's now turn our attention to C-3PO. There are many ways of painting any miniature, and this is never more true than when painting metallics. And, as usual, I will be presenting just one possible approach among many, but one that hopefully provides a good balance between simplicity and a pleasing end result that is easy to replicate. Here's how I've chosen to approach C-3PO. We'll begin by priming the droid with a white primer. I'm then providing a dark silver base coat followed with a paler dry brush. A couple of layers of shade can then be applied to give us a golden hue and the desired depth of tone. We'll then provide some pale metallic highlights along with some selective glazing to give C-3PO both extra shine and depth. We'll then finish the miniature off by painting the remaining details as well as providing some optional weathering and a selective build-up of gloss varnish. Let's begin with step 2. Before painting the metalwork, I'm going to paint the gap around the waist with some pure black. Now we're going to paint the metal. The reasonable expectation might be for us to use a gold metallic paint for our base colour. The problem I have with that for C-3PO is that I find most gold paints are just a little too gold. Instead, I've chosen to provide a silver base coat using some Leadbelcher. After applying 2 layers to achieve a strong tone, I'm then going to provide a fairly heavy dry brush with some Nequon compound, although any bright silver colour will do. This gives us a bright finish and also the beginnings of some rudimentary light and shade. Let's now add some colour. We're now going to turn silver into gold with a simple application of Seraphim Sepia, remembering to always give the shade a good long shake before applying. Notice that I'm not too bothered about this getting into the waist area. We should take care to avoid the right leg below the knee, as during the time period that Imperial assault takes place, C-3PO actually has a silver right leg, as can be seen in the original movie trilogy. Holding the droid horizontally will help to prevent the shade from running down the leg whilst we do this. We also want to soak the shade up from the eye sockets, which we don't want to be too dark. Once the first layer is dry, we can add a second. We can see that this second coat gives us just the right depth of tone. We can now give the silver leg a wash with some Nuln Oil. With the shading complete, you could more or less jump straight to adding some varnish and you would already have a fine looking C-3PO. If you want to boost the contrast further, however, let's look at what we can do with some highlights and glazes. I'm now going to begin the highlighting with an equal mix of Auric Armour Gold and Runefang Steel. This will not only lighten things up, but will also increase the metallic reflectivity. The more layers we add, the shinier the finish becomes. I'm applying the heaviest highlights to the tops of the shoulders, head and chest area. We should begin to appreciate that we're not only creating contrast with light and dark, but also with different levels of gloss to matte. I'm now going to add some additional Runefang Steel to brighten the tone further. And I'm now focusing on the brightest accents on the miniature. We shouldn't worry if things start looking a little too silver, as we'll be countering this effect with an orange glaze later on. Now I'm going to use a yellow glaze, which I've thinned with a roughly equal amount of medium, and apply it just to the eyes. A couple of layers of this will be enough to give the suggestion that they are being lit from behind. I'm then adding just a small amount of red glaze to the yellow, and then using this to tint all of the metalwork, taking care to avoid the eyes and of course the silver leg. This counteracts the silvery look produced by the previous highlights, leaving us with a warm golden finish with minimal impact on the contrast we've built up so far. I'm now going to give the silver leg a few highlights with some pure Runefang Steel. Now that we've boosted the highlights, I'm going to deepen the shadows using a mix of thinned Agrax Earthshade with just a hint of Druchii Violet. This gentle purple presence will subtly complement the yellows, giving the droid a more pleasing overall look. We can brush this into all of the darkened areas of the miniature. I'm also applying this to the silver leg. Two or three layers can be applied to build up the depth and sense of contrast. Once dry, I might be tempted to go back in to reapply a few small highlights to ensure we really have achieved the strongest level of contrast we can. I'm applying these highlights to the lower ridge of the chest area, the raised ridges of the face, top of the head, and one or two other raised edges. We're now once again ready to add some finishing touches. I'm going to begin by painting the exposed cables with some Mephiston Red and some Screaming Skull. I'm also going to leave some of the cables just as they are. I'm now going to shade the cables down with some Nuln Oil, focusing on the ends of the visible parts of the cables as they disappear behind the metal suit. Now I'm going to deal with the eyes, and instead of using a brush, I've chosen to use a micron pen by Sakura. These have ultra-fine 0.2mm tips, making them ideal alternatives to a brush when painting pupils. Getting the placement right is still quite tricky on a model of this scale. Fortunately, however, because the ink takes a couple of minutes to dry, if things do go wrong, we can quickly wash it off with some fresh water and have another go. Next, I'm going to add a little grunge with some typhus corrosion. This is of course entirely optional, but I can rarely resist the extra bit of character that is created by the addition of some oily stains and dusty weathering. This is also yet another way in which we are able to subtly vary the colour palette, and when we brush it into the various grooves, we are also able to boost the contrast. Once done, we can add a layer of protective matte varnish. I'm now going to create quite a heavily thinned gloss varnish using a roughly 2:1 ratio of water to varnish. Rather than apply this to the whole miniature, I'm applying it more like a highlight, which means just to the brightest areas to boost the reflectivity and provide further contrast with the darker, matte, grungy recesses. If you do accidentally gloss over one of the recesses like I've done here, a little typhus corrosion will correct this. One thing to appreciate when using gloss varnish that has been thinned like this is that the intensity of the gloss can be increased with additional layers, again a bit like adding highlights. This allows us to create gradations in the levels of gloss. So an additional layer or two focusing in on the brightest areas will produce the greatest contrast between these reflective glossy highlights and the darkest matte areas of the droid. As usual, I'm rebasing the miniatures with bases by MicroArt Studio, the link to which you can find in the video description below. And this completes C-3PO. Thank you for watching. If you haven't done so already, please do subscribe to the channel and feel free to follow me on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. My heartfelt thanks go out to the amazing patrons who are financing the work that I do. The campaign has gone so well that I will soon be leaving my day job to focus on producing these videos full time, which means a lot more content for you all to enjoy. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Star Wars Imperial Assault. Happy painting!